Hello, everyone. It is 10 a.m. ish, Redmond time on a Tuesday, so it's time for more API reviews. We have a return to a blocking item that we may or may not finish in a 2 hour window. And someone who shall remain anonymous unless they anonymize themselves decided that we needed a gavel, so I call this meeting to order. All right, rate limit APIs 52079er. Where should we look?
Okay, so I think to kind of start off is the two main changes since the last API review are I changed a bunch of names to essentially rate limits and things that make sense for rate limits, and changing the permit from a struct to a abstract class, which mitigates a bunch of the issues we identified last time. So I'm not sure if we want to take a look over everything, or we just want to look at those specific changes.
So what might be helpful is repeating what you said yesterday at email, like what's the plan for six? And then I
Ah,
think maybe we can maybe just approve what you currently have under the, with the caveat that it's a preview, right? And then we can maybe adjust names as we progress. Or for example, maybe if you have more performance measurements and you come back and say, hey, the class was a mistake, we allocate too much on hot paths, maybe we need to go back to the drawing board and make it a struct or something, right?
hmm Yeah, so in terms of the plan, just FYI is that we started to review all of our commitments for 6.0, and this was identified as a potentially risky item, and we didn't want to rush the design or the implementations because we want to still have a high quality release. So the decision there is that instead of shipping it as part of ASP.NET Core in 6.0, we will be shipping it as a preview package out of band, out of ASP Labs, but we will still preview these abstractions, these implementations, and a middleware that is built on top using these abstractions out of ASP Labs and shipping that in the preview 6 timeframe as a preview package.
I assume everybody here has no objections to that, right? I mean, when we discussed this over email, I said we should pick the names that we think are likely the final ones. So I wouldn't call it like Microsoft.ASP.NET.Labs.Experimental.rate limits or something like that, right? I would go with something that we think is what we think is the final shape. And then if we make breaking changes based on feedback, yes, we will break people, but at least we only break the people that happen to use the thing that we are breaking rather than guaranteeing that we will break everybody by changing namespaces or package names or stuff like that, right? I interpret silence as a agreement.
I agree. Should we discuss the namespace, or is that like too
Yeah,
much?
we
Like,
should.
Sure, we can. Yep.
No, I think that's probably the biggest thing we should get today done is like the rough shape, which is the namespace, the package name, the type names, and then we can red hole from there.
Sounds good. So I think just to start that conversation off, from last time when we discussed the namespace, the proposal then was to put it under system runtimes, and it'll be a new sub area under that. So what I've currently put in the proposal is system runtime rate limits. Any thoughts about that?
Is system runtime like too low level? Like if you look at all the other stuff that's in it, I mean, we do have caching, I guess, which is kind of not really that invested in, but like things like interop services, compiler services, intrinsics,
Remoting.
serialization, remoting. Yeah, it doesn't like this feels like a higher level concept than like this the low level stuff that's in system runtime.
Yeah, because mostly it seems like it's about the .NET runtime, aside from versioning and caching.
Mhm.
Uh,
Right, exactly.
serialization's weird because it was largely about how the runtime serialized itself across remoting channels. But
I mean, the reason I'd originally suggested system threading was because there's sort of two categories here, right? There's the concurrency limiter one, and the key example there is semaphores, and that's all about, like, concurrency is all about, we merge the concepts of threading and concurrency into one namespace called threading, even though lots of stuff related to concurrency isn't exactly manipulating threads. So concurrency kind of fits there. And then for all the rate stuff, like, it's all, timers and how many things are allowed to happen within a given period of time. We also have that in threading. So it seemed like all of this stuff sort of naturally maps to that same category stuff, even though the concept of thread doesn't show up here.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I found threading a bit odd, because I mean, maybe my mental model is wrong, but I think of rate limiting not as something that is directly related to concurrency.
But like cancellation tokens and system threading.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the question is, like, I think the reason why I suggested is runtime, because I looked over all the other names and no other names fit, and usually, like, we try to avoid adding, top level namespaces unless there's a really new concept that deserves that. And so I would agree that threading or maybe runtime, but if nobody else likes runtime, then maybe it's just threading are the only really good candidates.
I definitely like threading more than I like runtime.
That sounds good to me then.
Yeah, the only other one that has a semblance of fitting is IO, but
yeah, I mean, yeah.
So it's very often related to IO, but theoretically it doesn't have to be specific to IOs.
Yeah, so threading makes sense to me. For the reasons that Steve said, that's where we put all of the stuff that has to do with the notion of time passing, and two things contending for the same resource. And that's, if we go back to the previous name of this, you're both asking for the same lease, and one of you gets it and one of you doesn't. So,
and then it would be system threading dot rate limits.
Yep. I mean, we can talk about whether the namespace should be rate limits.
I think the rate limits or rate limiting, or it's all fine.
Yeah, ing seems better to me, but I don't know why.
It goes with threading rather than threads.
Yeah, I think I like ing also more because it describes a concept rather than a set of things. I think I think threading dot rate limiting sounds nicer too. I don't know why, but
I mean, there's a parallel between threading and rate limiting.
Yeah, that's probably it.
The other two third level namespaces in threading are channels and tasks.
Yeah, neither one seems good for this.
No. Point being is they're plural, right? They're not channeling and tasking.
Well, but neither of those really make sense. And what we have in tasks are, task and task of T, and value task of T, and it's the tasks. And what we have in here is concepts about rate limiting.
Maybe John, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but for tasks and channels, like, those are really one type in each of those namespaces, and then a whole bunch of types that are in support of that one type. Whereas here, it feels like there are multiple abstractions and multiple concrete implementations of those abstractions and factories. Right. And so it's more like a whole bunch of things that are working together as a system, whereas this other namespaces is like one thing and a bunch of things supporting it. Is that a fair assessment, or no?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of parallels, but I would say, like, for example, channels. There is that channels static class, and then you do like channels dot create bounded or create unbounded. And in this case, for rate limits, it is rate limiters. There will be different implementations of them, which are public as well. So in terms of like supporting one class or not, I'm not sure how to interpret that, because in the rate limiter case, for example, there is that rate limiter like main abstraction, but there will be several implementations of it. is that similar to the case for channels? I'm not too certain.
I mean, we
to
don't have
draw
to
that.
dive too much into the details, but with channels, you you basically have a factory that produces a generic, and everything else is effectively an implementation detail. Like all the current, at least currently, all the concrete implementations are internal, and
I see. Okay.
so. But it's this is we're talking about ing versus s, so it's not the biggest deal to get a perfect parallel drum.
I mean, if we wanted to go that path of the plural, then I would probably call it rate limiters, because the core type is a rate limiter, not a rate limit. But I think then, I mean, you could say, given the types that you have here, that the core type is rate limiter and everything else is in support of that. That's probably not completely crazy, but it seems that effectively it's always two things that somebody would have to deal with, right? The rate limiter and the permit lease, right? And somebody who extends that would always extend both of them, which,
Right.
I mean, to a certain extent, I think to me rate limiting makes a bit more sense, because I feel like once you're done with all your abstractions and your utility types that you will add over time, I think it will probably feel more what Steven said, like where you have a system of things that is in support of the idea of rate limiting, rather than you have this one core type called rate limit and everything else is logically in support of that.
John, when I type using system runtime or system threading rate limits, whatever, like the very next thing I type, is there like the 99% case for someone's the first thing they type is like rate limiter dot, or is it very varied what they do next?
So I think it'll depend on whether you are instantiating one of these rate limiters or whether you're consuming them. So if you're consuming them, let's say for a middleware where essentially you get passed a bunch of rate limiters by the customer, then you will type probably rate limiter. Whereas if you are a customer and want to create one of these limiters to pass into another component that uses it, it will likely be some kind of like instantiating some implementation of rate limiter. So
With new syntax or with factory syntax off some other rate limiter type?
that will depend on, I guess, some of the support we want to provide. I haven't proposed any factory kind of patterns yet, because so far it seems like every specific implementation should just be newed up. But if we take a look at the specific implementations and feel like they need factories, we might do that. But I would say that right now, let's assume that there is no factory and you just new up the individual rate limiters.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion. I was asking purely because I think it was either Eric's point or maybe Jeremy's point. When you use system threading tasks, the 99% cases you type task dot, and then for channels it's channel dot. I was wondering if there was a similar thing here, rate limits and then or rate limiter and then rate limiter dot, whatever. But
Yeah, I think for now that's not going to be the case. So rate limiting does sound more, I guess, appropriate.
Yeah, I take back my concern about having it plural. Like I'm convinced the ing is probably the right way. Like Emo's description made sense to me, that it's going to have a collection of things in it.
Okay, I'll make a note of that.
Yeah, let's just pencil it in as system threading rate limiting then.
Yep.
And then I think that would also be the package name, right? I think.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah.
So the next thing that may be worthwhile talking about is then the types you have in here. So one thing that I'm somewhat unsure about is you have these extension types at the bottom. Like, why aren't they just normal instance methods that are non-virtual on those types? Seems a bit weird to have them separate.
So I think the difference there is whether you have overloads of acquire versus having extension methods. Is that?
Yeah.
I guess it's just depends on. Uh, I mean, I don't really have a great answer to that, but is there a
So
preference for one over the other?
yes, you need a reason to be an extension method.
So I think the reason why I've seen it in ASP.NET is people very often think of this as layering, as in if I can implement it outside the type, I should. I kind of don't subscribe to that model because first of all, like that might change over time, and then you're just limiting yourself if you're outside the type. And then secondly, because when you build an extension method, you by definition need yet another type. So that means you just clutter the namespace more, you have more moving pieces, right? It's just much easier to just make it an instance method that is on the type that is not virtual and just forwards to the other thing. And then if we ever need to change it, we can.
Okay. Yeah,
So
I
that's
think our usual pattern is if it's like I guess extensions are almost thought of as syntactic sugar,
right.
which we believe that these were, because essentially it's not part of the core functionality that you need to write in implementation. But again, if we want to make those to be just another method on rate limiter and permanent themselves, that has a virtual implementation. If that's the pattern that is preferred in .NET runtime, I can make that change.
You don't even need a virtual. You don't need virtual on it, right? Because there was no virtual
Oh,
yeah.
sure,
on the extension method.
Yeah,
The
you
other
would
thing
just
is ASP.NET likes to use interfaces as well, and that
Right.
kind of fits in here better because then you can. It's basically like dims, but before dims.
you don't implement them every single time. I mean, default parameters work to a certain extent, but in this case, you could probably also make it a default where you just say the count, whatever is defaulted to 1. That would also work. But I think the general pattern, I think, so the downside of extension method is just the amount of moving pieces, right? And the discoverability, right? If you're actually looking at the doc page, it's just shittier when it's extension methods because they're like far away, right? They're in their own category of extension methods at the very bottom usually. So when you look at one method, you don't see them as overloads, so people may not discover them, and then sometimes you put them in different namespaces, then you don't even see them. So like it's just like I think for me extension methods make sense when you add glue between different technologies and they, for example, immutable array and link queries, for example, make sense to have them as extension methods in a separate namespace. But like for things that are in the same namespace and logically are less just overloads, I would just make them regular methods. It's just easier.
Okay. Yeah, just one thing I want to double check in terms of like breaking changes and stuff. So for example, for permit lease extensions, that is essentially kind of related to the curated set of metadata names. And if we were to add one later, adding these overloads should be considered non-breaking, right?
Well, in this case, it's not even an overload. It's just a net new method. And it's not virtual. It's not abstract.
Oh, sorry.
So,
yeah, new method.
Anything that's non-virtual is the same breaking scope as an extension method, basically. So if you could have added an extension method, you can add an instance method.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't really have. I mean, the only difference between extension methods and instance methods is that instance methods trump extension methods, right? So, but if they both ship in the same assembly, it makes no difference, right? Your scope is the same no matter what. I mean, I would generally assume that everything is up for breaking changes here, right? Because you ship your first version, you will get feedback, you will probably change something, and so I would just keep my options open here and say, yep, sorry, we want to rename the type or change the method name or move from a struct from a class back to a struct. All those things should be okay, right? And so I would not design any of this API shape with the idea that you can reduce breaking changes because it completely depends on what the feedback ends up being anyways. So just basically design the thing with the idea that this is the perfect API shape, and then if it turns out to be the wrong one, change it to whatever the perfect one is, because after you ship your stable version, it's frozen anyway. And so then there really is no more breaking changes, and it doesn't matter whether it's extensions or not.
Well, I took the question to mean between like V2 and V3 of adding more well-known metadata things, at which point it's still you're additive, you're not breaking. So.
Right. I mean, we generally, I mean, you can imagine cases where somebody breaks because you had an overload. We generally don't accept that as as a reason to not add an overload. I mean, unless we know that common call size will now be ambiguous. But like there are cases where you had an overload that took an object, and you had another overload that takes another class, right? And now if somebody passed a null, now it's ambiguous or something. We generally don't care. I mean, we care, but we don't care that much. Because we need to be able to add new APIs, right? So as long as the change is additive, we generally accept that as a risk.
Okay.
And any change you have is usually source breaking, not binary breaking, right? Because the compiler bakes in the actual method. So, you know, if the source doesn't recompile, then it's, you know, the danger is much lower, right? It's like worst case, the person has to insert a cast somewhere, right? Which is also not the end of the world. If libraries suddenly no longer bind, that's a problem. Right.
Right. Yeah, I'll make a note of that, extension methods to instance methods. So.
Yep.
Cool.
All right. There's a method called available permits. That's lacking a verb, so it should be get available permits.
Ah, yes.
Where do you see that?
It's
Oh yeah, on the very first one, yeah.
I think I didn't quite get that naming correct after changing it from a property to a method, so I'll add that.
Can you remind me why we changed it to a method again? Is it because it could be expensive?
Because if you write it in a for loop, you have a bug.
Basically, is you have to cache the value, right? Because every time you ask, the value might change.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not really consistent with that. I mean, there are other examples in the BCL where we made things properties, but for things like that, where you kind of have concurrency built into the system, it seems like a bug farm if you don't do it.
So I think the reason why I used to have it as a property is I believe semaphore has was it current count? That's a property, I think. So that's originally how I kind of modeled it, but yeah, using it or changing it to a method is not the end of the world either.
Yeah, that is something that goes into this fine tuning with customer feedback, right? But I think it makes sense that I mean, when people see methods, they almost always make them locals because it looks weird to call methods in a loop or something, right? Yeah. So it generally like forces people to do the right thing. Or it nudges people the right way, I guess.
Okay.
Why do we have these core methods now?
That's Jeremy's thing, I think.
Template method pattern.
Is acquire just going to call acquire core and pass through the parameter and not do anything else?
So permit count, negative permit counts don't make sense. So there's going to be an argument exception. So by using template method pattern, all implementations will correctly throw for negatives, and then no one needs to validate it.
So it's just for shared arg validation.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the benefits of the template method pattern.
Yeah, and I had
actually not make sense.
So, the question depends on the implementation. I don't see a scenario where negative makes sense. Like, can't you even do the same thing on a semaphore? Like, acquire negative numbers?
We do want the ability to express putback in the future.
That would be done via additional APIs, I think. Okay. So essentially for rate limiters, or let's talk about, for example, a concurrency limiter implementation. So how it's done is that there is a private release method on it, and the permit lease that is returned will call that private method, but this is not exposed to the like user publicly. So like users can't call release on a limiter themselves. And essentially that's something we kind of want to prevent.
And then presumably partial return would be something on the lease and not on the limiter.
Correct. If we support, I think it's either in here or in the design doc I sketched out what partial acquisition and partial release would look like. But yeah, the partial release would be a release method, or we can talk about naming, but essentially a release method on the permit lease itself. And you pass in essentially how many you want to release. And it keeps track internally of how many permits you have and how many you're trying to release, and you can only release as many as you acquired.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I actually had a comment about like that int validation. I think if that is the only validation we want, I was suggesting maybe we should just make it a uint, but I was told that that is not a .NET pattern.
I think
mean,
Emo's
one
face
question
said
I
it
have-
all. So
Yeah, well, the problem with uints is it's just you. I mean, if you could start from scratch, maybe, but I mean, if you want to get the experience of using uints for a little bit, deal with the WinRT APIs for a while in .NET because they're all uint based. And what ends up happening, because everything in .NET is an int, you end up having to cast a lot. Like it's just yes,
I
in
see.
principle, but like in practice, it's just super annoying.
Okay. Yeah, so then in that case, yeah, we should keep it an int and then add the default checks in acquire.
I mean, my question is like to Jeremy is like, do we think that argument validation is sufficient? And normally I would expect a core method or this template method pattern when you have like overloads with different argument shapes and you have like a common worker where they all basically forward to that common worker. But if the only thing you get is argument validation, it seems a bit over-engineered for my taste.
I mean, maybe so. Like in this case, the argument is simple, and so it can be argued that it's marginal. There is also, once we merge in the extension methods, if we do it as overloads instead of defaults, the permit count is, or there's an overload of acquire, and if we do it as defaults, then we definitely want it using template method pattern because you do not want a virtual with a default. And
well, you could still have acquire and then the acquire overloads, then only one of them is virtual, right?
Right.
The
Well,
same thing.
yeah. So if you have
Also-
acquire void and acquire int, and
Yeah.
the void one just calls int one, then it could work. The int validation is reasonably simple, so it doesn't buy a whole lot here. There are certainly cases where we have what look like simple methods that take a struct, and the struct has a lot of consistency that needs to be validated, and so I know, like for crypto, it's like RSA import parameters of where not all of the types in framework had the same level of checking on it, and sometimes they throw random exceptions late, sometimes they throw pre-validation early, and that was a thing to clean up. In the case of these task ones, most people implement asynchronous methods wrong. Argument validation, according to
Yeah.
Mr. Tobe, should be done before the task is created. So
Right.
if you have a virtual that someone implements as async and then they do argument validation, they've thrown from within the task instead of outside of the task, which means they did it wrong. And so by doing the core here, the argument validation happens in a non-async method that then says return, call another method, and now you have properly encapsulated inside and outside the task.
I see.
So
And it's not as simple as to say you do argument validation before the first await.
you have to do argument validation and then call a different method.
Because if I just do before the first await, it might still happen inside the task.
It is inside
It's
the
basically,
task.
if you have
If you
because
write
if you
async,
have
it
any
returns the
await,
task always.
yeah.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I don't. The only validation we're talking here is on whether permit count is non-negative. I don't know that it's worth this separation for that. If there was a ton of argument validation, then maybe. But there are plenty of places where we have async methods, and we rely on the implementation to do appropriate argument validation and to do it in a way that makes sense. I don't know that this split is warranted here. If that's the only reason the split exists.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's just it's a thing that I largely learned about as the suggested guidance when revising the
Right.
guidelines, and I'm like, oh my god, this template method pattern thing is amazing. It would have solved so many API problems I've seen. Why do we never use it? So I try and push it a little bit.
So you're saying you're the excited child that found the new toy?
Yeah, pretty much.
I see. No, I think I mean, the one thing that I would say is like I'm pretty confident as we are adding more abstractions, and John and friends will figure out that the abstractions that they designed here will not hold up, right? So I think we'll probably have to change the core at some point, would be my guess, because it will be the first time that we designed an abstraction on a whiteboard correctly. You probably have to have some amount of implementations first to actually see whether they actually hold up. And so, like, once we have that, I think we will probably find that, yep, here's some complication where extracting a core method would make sense. But I think to me, just for item validation, it seems a bit, I don't know, it's not just over-engineered, it just makes the type more complicated to understand, to implement, I mean.
Not really.
So
All right, you're implementing acquire and you're implementing wait async. And then the rest of it is like the base class handled some stuff for you. So yeah, so if we make acquire be a proper overload and not a default, because you had mentioned make it a default parameter, then I don't really care. It's just
Yeah,
suggestion.
What is the current prevailing pattern in runtime? In ASP.NET Core, for example, we always prefer overloads instead of default parameters.
Yeah, it depends. So like basically, the problem with default parameters is that the Azure SDK did a bunch of usability studies where they found that some of their core methods that you need, for example, the connect method, which everybody has to call to like establish a connection to the server, took like 12 optional parameters, and people didn't realize that, and they tried to fill in every single parameter, and then basically gave up halfway through the exercise because they couldn't figure out all 12 parameters. And so the idea is that overloads are generally easier to understand the fewer arguments they take, right? And so, but there are cases where it's just, when you have like 2 to 3 arguments and they're super simple, right? They're ins or names and they're defaulted to null. Like even if people don't get that they're defaulted, nothing bad happens. They're passed in 0 or an empty string or null or whatever, comes to their minds. And that tends to work very well. Like as soon as you have like 12 arguments or something, then you better have a super simple overload that only takes up to 3, right? That's kind of roughly the guidance. The other thing is defaults only work for literals, right? If you have like some sort of complicated object that's the default, you can't express that with default parameters, right? You would have to say, well, it's null, and null means whatever the ambient default is, right? Yeah, basically the default values are baked by the compiler into the call side, right? So you can't change the default values ever. That's the other thing, but that's, generally it's true no matter what you do, because if you change them in the overload, then also bad things happen, right? So.
Okay, so I guess what I'm hearing is that for I guess these simpler APIs, there's not too many arguments. It's preferable to have overloads.
To me, what I like about default parameters is that they're documenting, right? They tell you what they are, because they show up in IntelliSense as permit count equals 0, for example, so the default is 0. If you have an overload, you kind of have to read the documentation. So like that's why for simple values, I personally prefer optionals, because as I said, you can see what the actual value is. But the problem is when you have people that don't understand that the brackets in IntelliSense mean optional, they just will pass in values for those, right? They don't understand that they're optional. And that's the trade-off. So if you only take 1 or 2 arguments, I think it makes no difference.
Right. Unless you're virtual, in which case only cancellation token is allowed to be defaulted.
Yeah.
Right. Saurabh actually makes a good point about. Wait, hold on. Overloads are better for DI constructor injection, but these are not constructors. Acquire isn't a constructor.
I was trolling. Sorry, I thought the winky face made it clear.
Oh, sorry. It's hard to. Well, okay. I should have seen that.
You can't joke about DI. There's too much PTSD on this team for DI.
Just an FYI, the emojis are tiny, so to me that just looked like I didn't see the wink. It just looked like a smiley face to me.
I see. Yeah, that's also a point.
Okay, so if it Yeah, it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm just going to let's see. Yeah, like I mean, we should follow the prevailing runtime pattern, but it sounds like if it doesn't matter, I guess I'll just pick one and go with it.
Well,
Yeah,
you
what
have
might
two
help.
things that are related, which is, if people feel that the template method pattern is too much for this type, then now you can no longer use defaults for permit count, and you have to use overloading. If you keep the template method pattern, now you have a choice.
Yeah, so basically the idea is when you have virtuals, the problem is if you have default values, everybody who overrides has to repeat those defaults and have to have the exact same defaults. Because the problem is when you have different defaults between different overrides, now it totally depends on the static type that the person invokes the method on, which defaults they are getting, which can be very confusing and non-intuitive. Because people use var all the time and they don't understand that, oh, on the base type the default is 0 and on the drive type it happens to be 3, and no, like sometimes I get, I ask for 3, sometimes I ask for 0, and it's super confusing, right? So that's why we said for virtuals, the only party that gets to define the defaults is the base, and so the only way to really bake this into the system is by saying you have an overload that just, literally hard codes the values.
Fair enough. I think, well, personally, I think preferring a simpler solution, maybe even without the templating, I think that makes sense to start off from there and essentially based on the feedback and implementations we have, see whether there's enough complexity to kind of warrant it. The only thing I kind of want to draw a little bit of attention to is that we do have a default for the cancellation token. I think that is the common pattern we have. So just making sure that.
So the only legal value for a default for cancellation token is default. So the only thing that someone could do differently in an overload is not specify the default and enforce it as a formal parameter, and that one we're okay with. So cancellation token is permitted to be a default in virtuals. Everything else we think is a bad idea to be a default in a virtual.
Okay. So I'm going to put that down as we'll prefer simpler APIs with overloads and not have the templates until proven that there is significant value for that. Would that be okay?
I mean, the one value is, I mean, there's kind of two values, but to the caller, the one value is we can do the default parameters, right? I do kind of agree with Emo's statement before that when you're doing IntelliSense, you can do acquire, and it's like permit count equals 1, right? As like the default, and you can see it right there. So I mean, to a caller, there is value because we can do the default parameter. Uberly, like there's two advantages to it. One is the parameter validation, which you said, which is really only for implementers. But then two, the default parameter does give value to the caller. So I kind of think that's enough justification. I mean, I don't think I liked it at first, but then you have two reasons, right? And it's kind of like, well, that's two advantages that we don't have the other way. Good enough. And to a caller, they don't see, right? The callers never see the core methods because they're protected. So it's only about does the implementer, does it override acquire or acquire core? And the way I override things is I type override and then let VS tell me which things there are. So there's really no drawback, I think.
If the main concern is, it's virtual, so some overrider could use a different default value, then maybe we should just have an analyzer saying, hey, you're overriding and you're using a different default value here. That seems like something that reasonably catch the common scenario, and then it's an explicit, I want to be different and I'm doing the bad thing.
That sounds like I mean, it'll be beneficial for not specifically this API, but just in general. Right.
That does sound like a good analyzer to have in general, beyond this.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Jeremy, I pasted in the current API shape as we discussed it. Would it be worthwhile for you to open an editor and just so we can revise it as we go, so we can see what we kind of agreed on so far? Because I mean, I have a hard time stitching what we see on screen with the decisions we already made to understand what we want to do.
yeah, that's fair.
So this is so I basically removed all the extension stuff. I renamed the things based on what we said. I have not undone the core non-core split, so maybe we want to do that.
Well, I think Eric E was now convinced that we should make acquire be a default and then keep acquire core so that we have the don't have defaults in virtuals.
Yeah, that works. But then let's just edit that in here so we can see what the result looks like. That would be 0 or 1. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
1.
Cool. I like how that looks like.
Okay. All right. So I think maybe we should move on to the permit lease if we're happy with the rate limiter.
Be a little easier on everybody's eyes here. Yep. Okay, I'll drag this off and look at something with syntax highlighting, because despite the fact that I've been the host for, 3 months now, that I haven't installed anything on this machine.
Yeah, I was about to ask, like, you're aware that there are editors that have syntax highlighting built into them, right?
Yeah,
and also more than one level of undo.
Yeah, and they're on, this machine over here.
Yeah, personally I've converted to using VS Code for most of those purposes.
Did I see ReSharper?
Yes, you saw ReSharper, and you saw ReSharper, in fact, not being able to figure out where system private core lib lives, because for some reason we break that every other month. So.
In fairness, our build infrastructure is not really friendly for tooling.
Right, so all right, so permit lease. I guess there is the 2 other try-gets from the try-get metadata being merged in, but
right. So the idea with the permanent lease, just to kind of level set, is this represents a ownership of the permits that you've acquired from the acquire or wait async method from the limiter, and it is disposable, so that when you dispose it, all of the permits that you've acquired are returned. For rate limits, so time-based rate limits, that will be a no-op. For concurrency limits, that is actually calls a release on the actual rate limiter implementation. Yeah, and the two other things on here, is acquired represents whether your acquisition, so acquire or wait async, was successful or not. And try get metadata, that is the way for the specific implementation of permit lease to report back additional metadata. So 2 common ones we've seen are retry after and reason phrases for failures, but if the implementation wants to return additional metadata, they can.
I see. So now I think it makes sense to me. So basically, you're basically saying here that logically your permit lease is a bag of metadata name and objects, and then you have effectively try get well-known metadata name methods that extract the strongly typed versions of that. if that's the pattern you have, I think there would be value in making the try get ones actual extension methods, because then you could say like, yep, there's a, the core thing only knows about metadata name, and then everything else is an extension. And then if you have higher level abstractions, the general pattern is, you define your own extension methods over permit leaves that, probes whatever keys you have, and that's the pattern you have. I think that would not be terrible. I think in that case, it would be a bit more warranted to extract these things out as extension methods. But I think for normal overloads, I wouldn't do it.
I see. Okay, well, that
So not having these be extension methods, would allow us to optimize the try get retry after. We wouldn't have to box that time span.
Well,
that's true.
That would require it being virtual.
So yeah, for the well-known metadata, we don't expect those to be virtual.
Right. I see. So the implementer has to effectively decide what the storage for that is.
Yes.
And the storage might literally be a field.
Right. That's how I've done it for the rate limiters right now for retry after.
Should try get metadata then be a generic, maybe?
So that was a consideration, but I've left it as object to be the most general. But are you? I'm guessing what you're trying to propose here is try get metadata of T, and then the T would
be... because it seems like if I know the metadata name, then I also know the type, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, worst case, you return null or a default of T, right? Because you're like, it's like, I couldn't find them. Because basically now you're querying for both the name and the type, and if one of them doesn't match, then you just return false, right?
Well, so that I was gonna say that's the question is for a try method, it's supposed to be you return false for one reason, where the reason can be foofy. And encompassing, and then throw for any other thing that goes wrong. It's not never throw. And
I think that's actually reasonable too here, because if you're passing a wrong type, then clearly this is an error that should be caught earlier. It's not like something at runtime changes based on the try.
Yeah. So try being this metadata value did not exist. Or sorry, try being false is this metadata value did not exist. Makes sense. And then if it's you call try get metadata of time span, and then pass the key for reason, then that's this doesn't make any sense, and then that would throw a something exception, a very specific exception type. Because that's you should know that these two things that this combination would never succeed.
I think that makes sense. I think if that's the pattern you want to do, I think you want a generic. I mean, sorry, that's the wrong word here. A method that doesn't take a generic parameter that allows you to enumerate the metadata, like just for diagnostics reasons, right? If I'm standing on a permit lease in the debugger, it would be kind of neat if I could find out what metadata is on that type, right? And it's a bit hard if you have a method that just always throws. So now I have to guess all the names and I have to guess all the types.
For a change in HTTP client with a similar property bag, we baked the type into the key so that people just couldn't specify the wrong type.
So essentially that would be a type that is on metadata name, or maybe metadata name of like
exactly
value.
So instead of just a strongly typed string, it was a string in type tuple.
Yep.
Oh, I see. So metadata would be the metadata name of T, right? So then it would say retry after would be metadata name of time span, and the other one would be of.
Well, or you just say metadata name, and it stores a string and a type.
Yeah,
but then you don't get
the HTTP API.
Oh, I see. You want the T on the metadata name, so it's used for generic inference into the try get metadata.
Exactly. So you don't have to like typecast the stuff yourself, right?
But at what point is the type the key? Just save yourself the name.
No, it's not that the type
Well,
it's not
you
that the
might
key is
have-
the type. It's just that
I
when you
know.
ask for that key, you always get that type back. You never get any other types.
I'm just saying, like, yeah, but I get the
So-
point that it's
Yeah, you might have two different keys that both, return a string, for example. So you can't really use the return type as the key,
Right.
if I understood your question correctly.
well, that's yeah, but you could, of course, just say create a custom type if you want to avoid conflicts. But yeah,
Yeah. I think most of the time, I think you want primitives as your types, and in that case, it's a bit weird to have, when you have like 4 ints and now you have like 4 different structs to just wrap an int. So at that point, metadata name of t would be probably easier.
Right.
But I don't know enough about the, right now you only have 2 metadata names.
Right. So the additional metadata, I don't want to give a explicit list because some of them are, Daron is on this call as well, so you can chime in and correct me if I'm wrong. But a lot of these values are numbers, so think of them as either ints or floats for essentially like a percentage of a limit currently being used up or something like that. So they're very often numbers, but some of them could also be pretty customly defined by each limit, some of which I think are defined by different services. So for intents and purposes, it's very custom for each service implementation.
Right.
Sean's right. You nailed it succinctly.
So so that's kind of why so far I've been trying to keep it as generic as possible. But I think we can have a essentially specified for the well-known ones. We can definitely specify both the key and the type of the return value, but we need to make sure that it's simple to add a essentially metadata key, like custom name and any type essentially.
Yeah, the way I would do it, you would have a static class metadata name that is non-generic, that is basically your enum, accessor, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But you have your retry after and reason phrase on, and then you have your read-only struct metadata name of t, that basically just takes the name as it does today, because the t is basically just part of the type, and then the actual properties would be typed as metadata name of time span and metadata name of string.
Should this metadata exist in a static class, or should the keys here be associated with the specific rate limiters that implement them?
No, my understanding was that you want some sort of like collection of common ones that everybody shares, and so having a centralized place where you can have your conventions, I think, would be useful, because you want multiple rate limiters to use both, to use the retry, right? You don't just want one of them to use the particular retry, right?
Yeah, I'm going to put my Jan hat on for a second, by the way, and say virtual generic instance methods. Like, this could end up being a problem.
Right, but then, yeah, I mean...
So
what you would probably want is to have the get method on metadata name of t itself, rather than as an abstract method on permit lease.
I mean, I don't know how you would do that as a non-generic, though.
Permit lease would give you the object that represents the data.
Sure, but now you box every single value.
Yes.
At which
Why
point,
is that better?
just go back to objects.
What's the cost though? Because an abstract virtual is just an extra dictionary lookup, right? Do we want to pay for that? Want to pay for an allocation for boxing?
You basically start doing weird things with a vtable at runtime, and it gets very expensive very quickly. Especially if you start having multiple different types in here. then you're paying for every single possible allocation or every single possible T that could ever be put in there. Like I don't understand it fully, but I know like every single time this has ever come up in the past, like it's always been, please try to avoid that if at all possible. Especially for something going into core lib.
Right, but this is not going into core lib.
Oh, well.
This is
Okay, well then at that point, like if ASP.NET wants a higher, size on disk footprint, more power to them.
I mean, in fairness, you only grow for the number of T's that you ever have metadata for, right? Which seems to be bounded by, timestamp, string, int, and then maybe float and double, and then that's it, right? You don't have like a super open-ended set of types here, right? It's still a very small number of types in practice.
And to be clear, it's not going to core lib for 6. Doesn't mean that like we shouldn't make it good, right?
Fair enough.
Basically, will all ASP.NET apps pay for this cost?
I mean,
very potential. I mean, a lot. Yeah, I think we could end up using this abstraction a lot.
Like this is meant for ASP.NET.
And more. Like, I mean, there's talking. Yeah. I'll let John talk about it.
Thanks. We expect this to be used in many other places. So in ASP.NET Core, we also want to use this eventually for Kestrel as well, and some of their data rate limits. In the BCL, we also have identified some of the other types that could benefit from this, channels, pipelines, streams, and things of that nature. And we also want to allow partners such as Azure to use this in their Azure throttling service, ACR, a couple of I think there was Intune, and a few other things. So essentially, this is expected to be a what's that term? Exchange type for essentially these rate limiting concerns.
So, I would also expect a lot of HTTP client users to end up using this because so many web APIs have rate limiting built in.
Right.
Yeah. If you do pursue this, talk to someone deep in the runtime who's more knowledgeable than us.
So when you call try get metadata, is that only on the error case? Basically, when the permit wasn't granted. So do you expect that to be super frequently, or like a hot loop kind of scenario? Or is that like rare enough that at that point you may throw an exception anyway, so the boxing is no longer relevant as a cost?
Actually, I want to clarify a little bit. So we so far the most common use cases we've seen for essentially retry after and reason phrase, those ones are only relevant when a request fails. But there is theoretically no reason why you can't create some metadata even on the successful cases. So another thing that we have seen, but it's not terribly as common, is essentially giving a status of how many of these permits as a percentage, how many have been used up. Again, like that's not terribly common, but it is a use case we have seen. So that would be relevant on success. So it really, I don't want to close the door and say, no, it's just generally not used on successful calls, but it's rarer.
I mean, basically, if it's only the error case, at which point maybe the allocation of the box doesn't matter, in which case maybe we can just go back to the simpler model where everything gets boxed and then you just have strongly typed, convenience, methods basically.
Boxing, what? Hey guys.
Hi there.
Hello. So we just talk about try get metadata.
Try get metadata.
So the original design was try get metadata that was non-generic and that had an out object, and then we said, well, what if we make the T part of the metadata name, so that when you ask for it, you only get back that T. But then the concern is it's a virtual generic, which is not great.
Generic hell. You know, Jan mad.
Exactly. So now the question is, if try get metadata is only called in the error case, maybe the box doesn't matter because you're already going down the expensive path.
I would boxing is fine. Maybe you can make it chunky.
In that case,
The
I
only
propose.
problem though, like the try get after and the reason, the try get retry after. That sounds fun to say. Try get reason phrase. Like maybe you want a single call that returns an object that just has both things.
Well, I mean, at that point, you really go down the exponential complexity.
I know.
I mean, one thing I would do is, like, if you're okay with boxing, I would just say, let's have a virtual that is non-generic, that does the boxing, and then have a non-virtual one that does the cast, that basically is of T. At which point you can just trivially ask, try get metadata, pass metadata name dot retry after, and you already get back the correct type. You don't have to cast yourself. And then you basically no longer need the convenience overloads at all, because it's, you know, a one-liner.
Emo had a suggestion of, I think it was Emo. No, not Emo. I don't know. Someone, Levi, of putting the get metadata strongly typed version on metadata name. So we'd have,
Yeah, so that avoids the explosion problem. It means that you have to unbox as part of metadata name of T, or metadata name of T would have to look for like an interface I can give you value of T on whatever permit lease it's wrapping.
yeah, I'm not so much talking about the boxing here, more that we could get rid of these try, get, retry after methods and put those on the individual method metadata name. So you just call metadata name dot retry after dot try get and pass the permit lease.
Yes, that would work. That was
But
what
how
I
is
had
that? But
originally
how is it
suggested.
better from the one that we're just typing on the screen?
Well, then it works for anyone's metadata, and we don't have our own private collection of metadata names, and other people have their own collection of the things that are important to them.
Well, I mean,
What?
this does too. What Emo's writing, it's just
Yeah.
you write A before B instead of B before A. But yeah.
Because basically the metadata name, like the static class, is just the, you know, the convenience accessor for the commonly used ones. You can still create any metadata name of T you want, right? So I think, Jeremy, the only thing is it's a metadata name of T that you pass in as the first argument.
So are we still keeping metadata name of T? Just
I'd keep the metadata name of T. I would just say that,
Why?
well, the
We
problem
need
is,
generics all.
yeah, here if we make metadata name have the T built in, then this abstract
Right.
method has to take the T.
Can we not do generics all?
yeah, if you go, yeah, so then you go back to the original design where basically the caller has to know the T, right?
Yeah.
Which might be okay, but that basically means that you just have to. I mean, basically, you I guess you have to choice, right? You either decide the caller has to know the T, in which case you probably want extension methods like the try, get, retry after that basically codifies that thing into the API shape, or you end up with something that we have on the screen right now where you say, well, the T is kind of part of the name. I guess at that point I would probably just say the non-generic version just takes a string, right? And because it's probably not, you know, because that's basically your worker, right?
You prefer a
And then-
string than like this name, this strongly typed string.
So you think that's the happy medium?
I don't like the T. T should
So
die in a
what's-
fire.
So what's wrong with the T?
What's it for?
It's so that you can have
To
this
avoid the cast?
retry after that tells you the answer to retry after is time span.
You basically don't need the try, get, retry anymore, because when you say permalese dot try, get metadata and you pass the metadata name dot retry after, it's already clear that it's time span. You didn't have to, basically all these extension methods now that you would have to define, you can get rid of because it's part of the metadata name.
So you're using the type on the method name to okay.
And so that means
Alright.
anybody who defines their own things, that they get decent experience
I see.
without having to define extension methods.
One quick thing, I think it's out T question mark of metadata, or is
You know,
it not?
it's a bool, right? Is that not null when true? Weird.
That once it's generic. Actually, I don't remember the answer. Once it's generic,
I think
question marks
it's,
get weird.
I think it's maybe
Yeah,
null and
one.
is
It's
what-
maybe null when false,
Okay.
because you don't
Oh,
know
okay.
that null is not a valid value for T.
Yeah, because something there didn't look right.
Yeah.
But okay.
Yeah.
That seems a bit more.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we think we can get rid of these.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And so then this is the doodle that I made of
Yep.
metadata name being all T'd.
Yeah.
So it's still just a strongly typed string, but with a helper type glued onto it.
Metadata name of T should have a non-nullable parameter in name, most likely.
Fair enough. The property is still nullable because it's a struct.
No, that's fine. You can still make it non-nullable because if you have default of T and you just start accessing properties, like that's on you, right? If you have like default of string, it's going to return null.
I feel like when we did all of our existing strongly typed strings, when we did nullability, we said even if they consider the value to be nonsense, that we indicated that the property could be null.
I think what we said is like if the only reasonable places where somebody gets a hold of that struct, the thing is initialized, we don't care. We basically make it
depends on who's producing. Like, are people creating this themselves in typical usage, or are the only way you get one of these things is from an API handing it back? So like the typical example we used for the latter case was an interface mapping, which is a struct that contains 4 reference fields, and you never create one yourself, and every time you get it back from the runtime, all the fields are always initialized. So we decided, all right, well, we're better off just saying, pretending that they'll never be null, because in the 99.99999 case, they won't be. I don't know what the case is here. Are you creating these things yourself?
I feel like the common case is you're just calling metadata name dot.
Right, those are the 2 most common cases, but we want to have the extensibility where.
The only way to use this type successfully is to call the constructor on it or to access one of the factories. Like if you do default of metadata name of T and then try passing it anywhere, it's going to blow up.
I guess that's true. The generic really, if things are taking the T as an input, then it's unlikely you would ever see default happen anywhere.
Do we have an analyzer that could help us with this sort of thing? Like, don't default construct this thing because name won't work?
There's a long discussion about non-defaultable value types.
That name sounds great.
So one question I have is like, why do we need to create it? Because you can never infer the T, right? Because you don't pass any T in. It seems like whether you say create of time span or whether you say new metadata name of time span, it's largely the same.
Yeah, I don't think create is needed.
Fair. I mean, okay. I put it there just because it's if most of what you're doing is metadata name dot a well-known name, that it seems like that people will have the finger motor memory of it's metadata name dot the thing I want, and then you call create when the thing you want doesn't exist. But we can get rid of it. Whatever.
I could see that argument, honestly. Like have one type with all these factories on it.
Target type new. Why is it a struct, by the way?
Which one?
The name.
That's what we do for strongly typed strings.
Why not a struct?
It's a static class.
And you can't default it. Then it works.
That's a good point. I mean, like these keys, like if you instantiate them every single time, you're doing something wrong, right? Like even if you have custom ones, you would expect somebody to define a static type with the common ones on it as well, right? So, yeah, ideally you don't pay for them every single time you use them. So maybe it doesn't matter. I can see that argument just being make it a class and call it good.
Fair enough.
Okay.
And then just tell people to cache them if you care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would probably
So that means retry after and reason phrase would also be cached internally.
So what would be cached internally?
Retry after and reason phrase.
Yeah, I mean the initialized ones only, right?
Yeah.
Here you don't have to cache them.
But I used the assign it once syntax.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, if you use an arrow, then it's very expensive.
Yeah, I guess I thought in the original case you would have used an arrow just to make life easier, but sure.
Okay. So are we ditching the create? Or are we
I
keeping
mean,
it?
I can see the argument, as you said. Like, I mean, it doesn't cost us anything, so keeping it is fine.
Okay. I guess we don't need IEquatable once we're not a struct.
Yeah, you kind of need.
Oh yeah,
values
we
and
do because we
metrics,
want
yeah.
it to be.
Yeah, you want it.
Well, but all that the
Otherwise, things
dictionary
don't
implementers
work.
are going to do is they're going to reach in and pull name off. But I guess that's true. Is it can, if it's its own equatable, then it can go ahead and define its case
Right.
sensitivity preferences.
I guess you can't really put in a dictionary, right? Because you don't have a. I mean, I guess you could put it in as object, right? Like, what would you type the dictionary under?
You can, yeah, you can.
You
You
would
can.
basically have to say dictionary would be of object, right?
Yeah, which means all the dictionaries are just going to pop the name property off of it.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I would generally expect nobody to actually have a dictionary. I would generally say they have fields, and I just say if you ask for this, you get that field. If you ask for that,
That's-
you get that field.
That's true. They're only going to
Yeah.
have like 6 metadatas, so that's just a switch. But
Try get
Yeah.
metadata here is just taking a string, so no one would have a dictionary of these in the first place.
Fair enough. Yeah,
True.
that's a good point.
And
Try get
yeah, in the-
metadata should probably not have the nullable annotation on it. The one that you're hovering over right now.
Why not?
Not null when true might not be correct for that overload.
because
Why?
null
Why?
could be a legitimate answer.
Yeah.
oh,
Oh, because
we
you're saying
don't know,
that-
right? Like it's a dictionary of, presumably it's a dictionary of string object question mark, right?
yes, but I think in this case, like, it doesn't really make sense that null is significant. Like, storing a value of null is the same as not having that metadata at all.
Is
I
it?
would argue.
I mean, like
Try
if
get
you
metadata returns false to distinguish between the two.
yeah, if you had something like get session ID for the lease, I'm just making stuff up. Null, like it would return true of the provider does recognize that session ID is a valid key, and it returns null indicating there was no established session.
How, in that case, how is that different from just not having a session ID? Essentially returning false. Like,
I mean,
think
the
from-
question. I mean, again, that comes back to what does the false mean from try get metadata? Is it the provider didn't recognize the key, or the provider has no value for this key, or?
I think the idea here
Should
is that there's a loose contract between the caller and the provider, right? And so it's all convention based. So I think the common code wouldn't care, right? The common code just say, if you happen to have a retry reason, I can do something useful with it. If you don't have one or it's null, well then I don't know what to do with it, right? So you would probably not distinguish these two.
Right.
But I mean, the question remains is like, can you really not think of a single case where null is a meaningful value? If the answer is no, then fair enough, we can remove that. But if there's a single one where that might be useful, you're probably better off just allowing it. Because, I mean, it doesn't cost you anything. You just remove the null annotation here and you just say, if you care, you can distinguish between not having the key and you have the key, but the value happens to be null.
Yeah, because I would say at that point, just get rid of the try semantics entirely and return object question mark, and the caller checks to see if it's null or not. If there's literally no difference between the two.
If you're doing the not null when true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that's actually a reasonable point. Is if you can't have a
you're now outing
combination
the
of
same
true
data
with
twice.
null, yeah.
Like if you're outing the same data twice, then the API could use some love.
That's fair.
Okay.
But that is why dictionary has the try get with null possible out, is because out could be a legitimate value.
Yep.
Or
Okay.
what I meant to say instead of what I
And
said.
then would you keep the generic try method though? For things like time span?
Yes.
Thinking that, yeah.
Do you even need to? With C#, like 9 syntax? The pattern match feels as easy.
But then it'd be like a nullable time span, right? I guess.
Right.
The
so,
thing is, like the downside with the syntax is the caller has to know what the T is they put in, right? The nice thing with the other syntax here is you can basically say, if try get metadata,
I see.
open metadata name dot retry out var x, and then the x is correctly typed, right?
I get it. So I see. It's interesting. This is a cool pattern. Type strings. Let's put it in the BCL. This is raw. The type strings. Type string of T.
Well, my proposal for strongly typed enums has not taken on.
Eventually, we'll get a standard property bag type that everyone likes, or at least hates the least.
Right. So to be clear, with the try method, you wouldn't have to write out the type name at all. It would just be inferred from like the static method name you chose.
Right.
Okay.
It's unfortunate that we would have a get metadata and a try get metadata.
Or the conclusion I thought I heard was get rid of the not null when true, and now we have try get metadata and true null is a possible value. It may never occur, but the API allows for it.
And when we still feel like there is significant reasons to distinguish between like the bool and whether it's null or not, or should we just make it get metadata and return a object ?
I mean, it's sort of up to you. Like, I was actually going to ask, should we even still leave this as public?
That's a good point.
Or is this now protected abstract try get metadata, and that all callers are expected to go through the generic one?
Yep. No.
And then the other question.
I'm just asking questions.
Yes, no.
And I think, okay, another thing to consider if you're trying to make things private and public or protected. So if retry after returns true with a null time span, and then you call the generic try get method, does that like throw? Does that return false? Like it can't give you a null time span at that point.
It would throw.
Sorry. Wait, can you repeat that scenario again?
So if the non-generic try get metadata for retry after return true, but gave a null time span, what would the generic try get metadata do in that circumstance?
So the try would mean the key does not make sense, and if the T does not make sense for the value, that'll throw.
I don't love having the object be nullable. Just because I'm trying to think of what are the cases when someone's using that, and it seems like in almost every case we'd just be adding more code that people would have to write to use this, because they'd have to check if the object is null now also.
Well, again, that's the question of who's calling it. Like if it's protected, then all public callers are calling the generic version. Their nullability is determined by the nullability of the property that was there. Or at least highly suggested by it. Right, because if it says it's returning a time span, null made no sense, the null is gone. If it's returning a string, then I don't know, we don't see the nullability at runtime, so we can't complain that we got null when we didn't expect it. But
yeah, I think if we make it protected, then I don't care, but if we keep it public, then I would love to have that metadata output just be not null.
So
well, how do you do
not
that?
Null and true.
Oh, yeah, okay, so you would basically say like you would return false in that case.
Couple of problems. I'm not sure if we have a scenario yet, but when you have these generic APIs and you're basically in code that doesn't have direct access to the strong types, and you're trying to basically flow code being passed in from the caller into this API, we might need a non-generic version of like this stuff to be public for those scenarios. I don't have one like right now, but
I mean, the one that I already said, like I think you want a non-generic enumeration, so you can dump all the things that are in there, at least from a diagnostic standpoint. Because I mean, how else do you debug this stuff ever, right? You need to be able to say, give me all the metadata names you know. So what I would suggest is to like one method, like one property that is just metadata names that gives you back an enum of string, another one get metadata that gives you back an enumerable of, I don't know, key value pair of string object question mark or something, and then you can at least dump everything that's in there. And quite frankly, I think at that point I would just have a public abstract, the try get metadata name that is non-generic, that gives you back object question mark.
String.
It has to be
Can't be
string because it
generic.
can't have the T, which is
Right.
sad because it can't tell you what the answer should be.
Permit list
Right.
of T.
Which
But
is
it's
why
really-
we need the
No, we need
object.
variant. We need variant. I'm kidding. We don't need variant.
what?
It wouldn't work here.
We have it. It's called object.
It is object.
Metadata keys, yeah.
I would probably call it names though, because I mean that's how it's referred to everywhere else.
Except it's not returning metadata names; it's returning strings. But yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And then
It's
Why is
almost
that
like
again? Sorry, I
metadata
missed
name names.
This is where
Why does that
generics
be
like
string?
break down. Because you can't type the list of names with the actual type.
Oh yeah, I was looking at the static class.
This bugs me. That's abstract. Maybe it should be virtual and just be returned.
I don't think this one needs to be abstract at all, because
Should
if
be
you have
virtual.
metadata names and you have the other one, you can implement it.
Yeah, this also might be. Are these objects cheap to create?
I mean, like if you have a read-only projection over your dictionary, or you're just willing to return your whole dictionary, this is one call. And if you have 12 metadata things that you support, then saying you gave me abstract, give me all your names, and I can go ask for the value for each one of them, that's 13 calls to return the object plus the yield enumerator.
Sure.
I'm just
I
saying
would at
that's-
least make it then virtual and implement, because
Yeah,
I
make it
mean,
virtual.
because I mean, frankly, like I don't think anybody ever actually bakes it by dictionary. I think everybody bakes it by fields and just special cases the name.
Yep.
That would be my guess.
Yeah.
Like what else?
That
would you-
is the most common case. Like, there is not too much of a reason to have like something as heavy as a dictionary in most cases.
That should be key value pair of string object question mark.
I was gonna say, now we're coming back to, are we object or object question mark?
I think it needs to be object question mark. What else?
Question
do you-
mark.
I mean,
Okay.
unless
So
you're
for-
willing to say like you can never have a null value. That's basically it.
Well, that is the thing that was being debated up here. Of, is this get metadata that returns nullable object, or is it try get metadata that can out a maybe null
Right.
object?
Yeah, so we can, I mean, yeah, we'll just say we need to be consistent, right? We can either decide it can be null or it can never be null. If it can never be null, then sure. But right now, the way it's written, it says, keys can be null independently of whether they exist or not.
I would expect most callers to use the generic method here, and the other ones would be more diagnostic-y or weird David Fowler-y stuff.
Whoa!
Yeah.
I actually appreciate that.
All right.
So we can
Power
make it
users.
helpful, I think, because most people aren't going to be doing those checks. They'll use the generic.
No. You need to think about library code. Like the core thing that generics like hurt for is that they're viral. So you need to figure out the case where a middleman is being passed something from a call that they don't control. I don't have a scenario to be honest, but like.
No, you're right. I mean, it's a very common
pattern.
thing. The person in the middle just knows the string and has no idea.
Right.
It just wants to store the value and forward it to somebody else, and they don't actually care what the value is.
Right.
I
Right.
agree with that. I've seen
Um,
this.
so on the one hand, this feels property-ish. On the other hand, it feels at least debuggerly expensive. You hit F10, it
I
evaluates
was
things
gonna-
again. So should we
No, it should be
method
cheap,
that?
right? It should be cheap. It should be like dictionary keys, because you basically did all the work on the call to acquire to get the lease back, and it should be like fixed.
My guess is the average implementation of this is going to be yield return, and
Yeah.
I think that returning just the state machine on that is cheap, but
It'll be
I mean,
dictionary
logically-
keys, I guess.
I mean, logically, you basically means every time you ask for the property, you get back a different instance, right? By definition, right?
I mean,
Yes.
I would expect here this to either just be returning dictionary.keys or a cached
Exactly.
array of strings, because the
Yes.
rate limiter knows what types it supports.
Right, but if you
Yeah.
only support like
Oh, I
three
see.
things, I expect you're just going to write it as yield return
No,
metadata name dot
that's-
retry after dot
You
name.
would
that costs.
you
Well,
could
it's in a
just
array.
create a static
Yeah.
like list of strings that you support.
Yeah, you probably like you override it probably with an assignment where you just say, you assign it once with a static set of like array, right? Because the strings are static, right? You
Yeah.
don't have to. I think for the
Right.
I think for the enumeration you would use yield when you actually ask for the values, because that's easier to implement. But that's why I said like
enough.
I don't think that you would actually get all metadata, because if all you do is yield return X, yield return Y, then you might as well just let it go through the try get metadata path.
Wait, how do you implement the generic one? How is that implemented?
So
I'm actually confused
call-
now.
that calls into try get metadata with string, and then it casts it to the type
I
that
see.
is represented
Yeah.
by metadata name
I
of
see.
t.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and then it tells you whether that's 60s or not.
It just casts the object to a T.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I
why
can't
it's
write that in a
virtual.
lambda. Yeah. Yeah, it's just a hard cast. Well, because I need to do the assignment as well, and so it's two.
Yep.
It's curly, but
Switch
How
expression.
expensive does this get now, John? Do you know?
I do not.
So like for the most part, those are gonna be null. In the
So
cases
what
where
do you
like,
mean? Those are going to be null?
the lease, the data in the lease will just be the count on a disposable thing.
Right.
I guess this is that thing. I guess
Yeah.
is that the only thing?
I mean, so far I haven't even put count as one of the curated set of like values, because that is
Yeah.
pretty much only relevant if you want to do partial acquisition or partial release.
Yeah,
And we don't do that right now, so there's no reason for a count. It's all
Okay.
or nothing, and then you dispose of them once you're done.
So all you're paying for here is the allocation to permit lease,
Yes.
and that's it.
Right.
Okay.
For now,
And
until you
you
want extra features. And
Yeah. Yeah. And those can be cache arrays and cache values for the most part. So the only thing you're paying, okay,
Yeah.
is the allocation, which we're gonna pool.
Pool as
I'm
much
kidding.
as
I'm kidding.
possible.
We won't pool. People are looking at us. We won't pool.
Yeah.
avoid avoid disposable rehydration.
You
Would it
mean,
be useful here? Could we have a permit lease dot unacquired or something, so that anyone returning an unacquired permit lease could just use the static?
Ooh.
So that I think I had like these static like failure things before. So essentially like permanent lease dot success, permanent lease dot fail. No, like essentially both of them would no op for certain things. It's probably best to leave that for the implementation, because for example, in failure cases, they might want to create different types of metadata on it, and in success cases, you might want to actually have fields that helps you dispose or release the resources back.
Yeah,
Okay,
like
that makes sense.
the
yeah,
rate
it
limiter
depends
with a
on your
retry after, right? You're gonna want if you have a non-variable retry after, you would just always return the same fail retry after 30 seconds.
Right. So like depending on the implementation, they could provide a static, result with a retry after, but we shouldn't be specifying that.
Going back to, we think that the metadata makes the most sense for failure cases, so having this singleton fail means you lost the metadata. And then the success case, obviously, dispose needs to be hooked up to something, so you can't have a
Yeah, you
good
need-
singleton for that one either.
Yep.
Right.
Is that dispose pattern? That's not okay, right? We would copy the dispose pattern. Like, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think I mentioned
Or is that
that.
fine?
Right, now that
Like,
it's
you didn't
back
say no.
now that it's back to a class, it should implement dispose correctly.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
I'd be very curious to see someone holding some sort of resource in this.
We won't pull it either because that would be so bad.
Cool, yeah.
The thing is, Clay, I could actually see it. Because you're round tripping it if you want to pull. Anyway.
Wait,
Never
are you
gonna
saying
pull.
we wouldn't pull these? Like, I could see returning an acquired permit lease that's just cash.
Oh, I think we would.
Well,
Oh, we're
if
gonna
you,
pull like crazy, but
if you pull it, now you're back to if dispose gets called twice, you've destroyed your application.
yeah,
Which
I
means
mean,
you're not
it's
being
illegal.
disposable correctly.
It's illegal.
Pooling failure is fine. Pooling success is dangerous.
Yeah,
One-
I mean the implementation can do it, right? But we
Right,
can't.
I mean, because like in ASP.NET, we would never pull a stream or anything like that that's been disposed or whatever. But yeah.
Yeah, we never
Yeah,
do that stuff.
You'd probably have to.
Levi, jump in.
I am well known
I
for
agree.
hating the dispose pattern with all my heart,
I agree.
because nobody should ever have unmanaged resources that are not backed by a safe handle.
Yes, but dispose means kill it now instead of wait for it to finalize.
No, I mean the pattern, like a
Oh,
protected method that takes a bool, blah blah blah.
fair enough.
Because
The question here was
any derived permit lease ever going to be finalizable? If so, like reconsider your life choices.
indeed, but the answer
yeah.
we came up with is we didn't want a pattern for types designed before 2021 or before 2020, and for types designed after that. So we stuck with the pattern for consistency. It is what it is.
Modern. You need a modern pattern that's not like 10,000 lines of code.
Well,
It's
I
fine.
mean, it's right here. That's the whole
Anyway.
pattern.
Yeah.
You can ignore the disposing thing. You can implement the protected as incorrectly as you want. But the,
you
the
missed
base
the call
class
to
should do it right.
GC dot
Suppress finalize.
Oh, yeah.
suppress finalize. Yeah, that.
Sorry, I forgot the second line of code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Protected virtual void.
Yeah. You act like disposing matters or something.
Is get available permits what estimated count was?
Yeah.
Get available permits. Does that need to be more loose? Like, don't use
What do
this
you
for
mean?
real stuff. To just record this as metrics. It's not really accurate.
That is, I believe in the comment in the proposal, I mentioned this is mostly used for diagnostics. So
Should we?
yes,
Okay.
it's the equivalent on the semaphore is essentially current count, right? So essentially
That's correct though, right?
What do you mean by that is correct?
Well, for semaphore, it's correct for whenever you called it, which is a race condition
Right.
with anything using the semaphore.
Right, which is the same thing
Okay.
here.
Alright.
The only difference is that one is a property, this one's a method, but like we kind of went through why that is the case, and I buy the argument. So
I choose to not engage there. That's fine. Yet.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
is
that's late for
your
now.
statement, David, that you think get available permit sounds like it's always an exact answer and you can trust it, but that it's supposed to be
Yeah.
able to be implemented as something fuzzy?
Yeah, I think it's gonna be fuzzy,
Um,
especially for like distributed implementations that use like Redis and stuff. It's gonna be like just wrong.
it's
It'll be an
going to
estimate.
be right, but
it's probably
From the-
it was correct at some recent point in the past, but it's probably wrong
Yeah.
by the time you read it, which is true of any concurrent API,
Yeah.
right? Like it.
Do we need a
Yeah.
Do we need a mechanism here for saying acquire, like try to acquire 10 permits, but I'm okay if you just return 5?
so that is partial acquisition, which right now we don't support because there's no, we haven't identified any use case for that.
I mean, I could see it being useful for streams.
Another thing that you could do is wait for that amount, right? So
what if you will never get that amount because it caps at 5 on the web service you're talking to? You wanted 10, the web service will only ever return 5.
Then it will, with the current set of APIs, what that would do is it'll always just fail. And then if you keep on trying with 10, then you'll keep on failing. But if you try a smaller amount, you might succeed. So
if I'm using this to rate limit a stream, and I have a 4K buffer, should I try to acquire 4K, and then if that fails, try to acquire 2K, or do you see the problem? Especially because some protocols might rely on that 2K at the front being sent before it returns some additional data to you, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think so. Originally, how we envisioned partial acquisition is that on the acquire method, you also indicate whether you are you are okay with it returning essentially a smaller amount than you asked for. So there's another boolean there, or we can just make a different method like acquire partial or something like that, and then on the permit lease, that is where you use the metadata to communicate how many you actually acquired. So that is our thought of how partial acquisition would work. And if we feel that that is a scenario we want to support, we can add that API as well. But yeah, I didn't include that in this proposal yet. But yeah, it just depends on whether we think we should include that as essentially the first iteration of this API.
If we think that most of the people using this API will just be using it to rate limit an HTTP client, then it's fine, but we should probably prototype a stream implementation.
Yeah, and it isn't shipping RTM in 6, so we got time to change it anyway.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I think we can start with this, and then as the prototype evolves, essentially for streams, we can have a different proposal that adds those capabilities. It shouldn't conflict with these APIs. It'll just be in addition.
Yeah, it feels like when / if you ever support partial or partial acquire, partial release, any of those things, you're probably going to want the lease to tell you how much it acquired. So should that already be something that's built in so that you can describe that? Because if you need a new virtual for it later, if you need a new virtual for it after you ship a stable API, you now have a problem. So if you want it as a virtual, then you want to go ahead and hook that up now.
I see. So it's so for example, is acquired is literally a field on permit lease, and the decision what we're trying to kind of make here is whether count should be something like is acquired, or it should be similar to all the extra metadata that we currently have for retry and reason phrase.
Yeah, like count feels like it's probably important enough that it would be a top level property or method, and not please go delve into the metadata and ask how much you actually got. I mean, I could be wrong, but like that would be the only way that you could extend it. If you shipped right now and you were stable, and then you added this partial support, and you wanted to let somebody get the data back, now you basically just have to describe anybody who supports partial should add support for, metadata name dot current permit count, and
and
now you have a
I can see that.
convention-based approach instead of a API
Just a
defined
bool
approach.
can count and then in the count property.
Well, I was going to say like essentially have a virtual count, and by default it goes into the metadata to look for it. But if you, use like in your implementation, you could just store it as a field.
Yeah, and that would work.
Yeah, essentially it allows you to kind of make it an additive API that we can add later, but it doesn't require us to have to put it on all permit leases. But I can, like, at least I think that is simpler, but I could be convinced otherwise.
Can we can we at least say that before this thing ships, we'll have a prototype with a stream, and hopefully that will drive if this property would be useful or not.
Fair. But even if it becomes useful in stream, does it mean we should have that on every permit lease? Or essentially should...
Yeah, because now you're back to the weird, like, that one maybe it's so coupled with itself, like that you no longer really are generic, that it needs to really understand what kind of rate limiter it's being given in order to make sense of things. So it could be that it's made sense in context, but not in the abstract.
Every lease does have a count of permits that it acquired, so it would be valid for every lease.
Yeah.
Right.
It's reasonable. That's why I asked the question of should it be exposed and how do you want it implemented. But I guess since we have about 10 minutes left, I don't think we've actually talked about the name permit lease. Does anyone, like, I'll throw out just as a straw man so that there's a thing to compare it against, rate limit lease, so that its rate limiter returns a rate limit lease. I'm fine. I don't have super objection to permit lease. It just feels like it's a more general name than the rest of the API around it. I guess metadata name is also, we might want to think about as, like, if you just see this bare word, should we give it affinity to its namespace instead of just a namespace? So those are the two things that I think we should talk about.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but it'll be very specific.
And we can think it's fine. I ask questions. So.
No, I think the name should be the same, even though it's super generic.
The HTTP one we added is called HTTP request options key.
That's why it's so bad though, so long. Let's not repeat our mistakes.
I mean, I don't think we've shipped that API yet, have we?
No,
maybe we shipped it in 5.
Oh, you did. I like rate limit lease. I think that's fine. I don't like rate limit.
Rate limit metadata name?
Yeah, that one I think is too much. I think that's this, yeah.
It's yeah, especially because it's already in the rate limiting namespace. Like, I think that's fine.
Right.
And if that conflicts with anything else, go alias the type.
Well, right. So the two concerns are, one, you have a bunch of usings at the top of your file, and now you have something in the middle that's talking about a metadata name, and you no longer have the knowledge that metadata name came from rate limiting. And the other is if two things that you would have usings for in the same file have the same name, then now you have to use namespace qualified type names or type aliases. And we think that if two things are going to commonly be used together and they use the same name, that's a bad design. So is this name overreaching is the question.
I see. Are there any other metadata names? Or will there be new ones?
I mean, we need a generic property bag thing. Maybe we put a little more time into this and call it system.metadata name or something like that.
Strong string of T. I think you're right though. Like, we should figure that out.
Is that a? I hope that doesn't add another like dependency on I guess this is essentially like, do we need to create that before?
No, we don't. But I do think it's an interesting thing we should look at. I mean, someone would have to write a proposal like and actually go through a design for that thing.
Right.
Corey sounds like he wants to do it, so I'm gonna put Corey should do it.
Sure.
Do it, Corey.
I'll use a lot of generic abstracts.
Oh my gosh.
So I think that let's see. So we covered the naming. Is that all we have for the for this review? Actually, is there anything else we want to take a look at?
Well, I mean, there's all the concrete APIs, but we didn't get there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So two I think things I just wanted to confirm a little bit more. One is that just a note that we also should take a look at the generic rate limiter, essentially the aggregated limiters of T key. I think before we ship this as well, although it is a parallel set of APIs, but that would be.
Question. You said before we ship this. What does that mean?
Oh, actually, sorry. Maybe just not exactly before we ship this, but we should consider the impact of having these two types. We can ship a preview package as is, but we should kind of. I guess what I meant is before we ship a RTM version, we should kind of work out what that looks like.
Yeah, if you missed that, David, the 6.0 plan is this ships as a preview package only.
Oh, I know.
Okay.
We should figure out the generic as in, I guess, the next API review because we're done now. But I like this so far. This actually looks pretty good. Now, feels right.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there will be a little bit more for specific implementations, I think. But yeah. At least the abstractions, I think, is in good shape. One other thing I want to call attention to is last time we did have some discussions on whether these like permit counts should be int or long. The reason why we said int is sufficient is we expected a scaling factor. So essentially, if you regularly obtain 4 kilobytes at a time instead of doing 4,000 or 4,096, you would scale that back somehow. But then it essentially means these limiters, like the count, are very abstract, and it's up to the implementation or it's up to the user to define what each permit or each count means. And I just want to make sure that that is still essentially what we think is fine. Oh, and one more thing, because you changed it to from permit lease to rate limit lease, before I had those counts as permit counts, maybe we should name those differently as well, as the arguments inside acquire core, await async, and all that.
I mean, I think if right, like permit is tied to permit is tied to permit, and that's fine. It's the object that describes the permits is.
I see. Okay.
Is the lease. So, I mean, yeah, I'll take the note that's
Would
Yeah,
it make
right.
sense to have is acquired be non-virtual and have it just implement acquired permit count equals 0, unequal to 0?
Well, that one's weird because the permit count of 0 is supposed to be allowed to be passed to acquire to test if the thing is already at capacity, I think.
Right.
And then that would
Oh,
be a
that's weird.
true 0.
Wouldn't testing for capacity just be calling get available permits? It would give you the same exact guarantees, right?
So it's a little bit different. Acquire of 0 will give you a permit lease which may have metadata on it. And wait async of 0 means if there are no available permits, let me know when a replenishment of those permits occur, but don't acquire any of them.
So 0-byte read.
Yes.
Okay, it makes sense. And we'd prefer that rather than having a get metadata on the rate limiter.
Yeah.
Yes, because metadata is generally tied to, or I mean, it makes sense to tie to a lease.
I mean, just calling acquire with 0 seems weird and a little hacky. It's definitely not obvious from the API.
Super nice.
Yeah, we got that question
like, I
in
kind of
YouTube
agree.
chat when discussing the argument validation, and I'd answered that I'd remembered that 0 was a designed valid parameter.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, like things like a timeout and stuff doesn't make sense for like acquiring nothing. Like I feel like the metadata you want for like a 0-byte read is almost different. At which point, why not just give it a different API?
It's not different. If you want to wait on the resource, then what a new API is like wait for resource. That is the same as wait, but takes no counts.
Right.
Say semaphore.
Basically.
All right, so I will fly through the notes that I took. Namespace, we changed it back under system threading, and now it's system threading rate limit or system threading rate limiting. We got rid of all the extension methods. We made get available permits or available permits be get available permits. We discussed between overloads or default parameters for acquire and wait async and went with defaults. Therefore, we kept the template method pattern. And we rewrote try get metadata. I think we spent like an hour on that. We made dispose follow the dispose pattern. We renamed
Can we
permit
revisit
lease.
that real quick?
No.
No.
we are over time. We will spend at least an hour debating that if we want to debate it. So no, we cannot revisit it today. And open question about renaming the permit count parameters given the name of the type, and then an open question slightly as to whether metadata name is overly general. And then I pasted the things in. Is there anything that we talked about that didn't get written down?
So can we then say this is the final one for the preview, or is there anything else we need to follow up for?
I think we need to review the implementation APIs as well.
Oh, we
but
only
for
looked
the
at the
abstraction.
I see.
Yeah, the abstraction I think is good. We can talk about the implementations, of which I have samples for concurrency and token bucket, but essentially I think those are representative of all four, which I have samples for in a ASP.NET branch, but I'll probably move it to ASP Labs and link it here.
Is this something that we could do next week, or is this something that needs to happen this week?
I mean, as soon as possible would be nice, but depends on, like,
Yeah,
I
because
would
people are
prefer-
pinging me on other API review issues, and I don't want to like block them for 2 weeks. It would be good if I could unblock some people in the interim and not do only this one thing.
Okay.
That's why I'm asking.
Right. I mean, I think ultimately the decision is up to you, but essentially, the implementations, at least two of them, which I think is representative of all of them, is ready to be reviewed. So, yeah.
Yeah, because I think like once we start talking, it will take 2 hours. So I probably like let's do next Tuesday then, so we can at least have one meeting in the interim where we can unblock some other people in the middle, and then
Okay.
you get a timely answer. But
Okay.
Sounds good.
I assume that means you're about to schedule a Thursday 10 a.m.
yeah,
All right.
Sounds good.
Okay. So I will hit post, and we're not done. So needs work just so the tool picks up something. Feel free to pop it back to
Yep.
ready for review in like half an hour.
Thank you.
And okay, so yes, as our discussion just said, the next meeting will be Thursday 10 a.m. Redmond time, where we will be talking about the backlog, which has other red things in it now. Hooray. All right. Having recently read the section on Robert's Rules of Order of how a chair is supposed to end a meeting, I observe that we are over time, and I declare this meeting adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Ciao.
I love the gavel. Whoever gave it to you is a good guy. All right.